and we have a support group on Monday evenings. And if anyone here who is not normally part of our Monday group and you are justice impacted, please, we welcome all comers. And it's certainly a safe place and a good place for you to meet others similarly situated. And if it's something that you are of interest to you or someone that you may know, please, you can go to our website and send an inquiry, or you can send an email directly to info@prisonist.org. I am subbing for Jeff tonight, who had some dental work done, so he's a little under the weather, and he's here with us, but we are we're going to handle things in his place. Generally, that's about. I really don't have any other announcements. Is there anything else, Jeff, that you might want us to mention before we get started?
Thank you, Bill. The only thing I want to mention, and thank you for subbing.
Sure.
It's wonderful to have a whole team here to be able to do everything. So thank you. The other thing I want to mention is that our speaker in September, on September 12th, will be Glenn Martin, the founder and former CEO of Just Leadership USA. He's also the CEO of GEM Trainers and GEM Real Estate. And he's going to be talking to us about how to achieve success after prison. He's going to take us through his story, the things that have worked for him, the things that have not worked so well, and what led him from being a dynamo in the nonprofit space to now an entrepreneur, where he is buying houses throughout the country, rehabbing them, and then offering them for rent to people who are justice impacted. So a great project, and he'll talk to us all about that in September.
All right, thank you, Jeff. I appreciate that. You were much better at announcements than I am, and I apologize to Sam earlier, but I'll apologize to everybody for my informal attire. I just got in from work, so I promise it won't happen again. So Sam, since we're done with the announcements, how about, let me hand the floor over to you. And we are really interested in hearing about you and your story and where you're at right now. So Sam.
Well, thank you, Bill. And thanks, Jeff, for inviting me. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here. This is my first talk about my book, and it's a closed talk, obviously, but it may be on YouTube later. Bill had pointed out. My book doesn't come out until October 3rd, so it's still relatively early. But before talking about the book, I wanted to sort of, qualify a little bit. And, obviously I'm justice impacted, which is why what I think draws all of us together on this call. And I've got a question that I don't want to dwell on a whole lot, but when I pled guilty before a judge, and I stood there before the judge to, hear the charge and plead guilty, she said to me something interesting just before I pleaded. She said, you realize that if the Supreme Court should later invalidate the law to which you're pleading guilty to violating, that your conviction will stand. And that's, one of the various. Does that happen to everybody? Does anyone else remember that happening?
I don't remember it.
I don't remember that either. Nor do I.
Okay.
I had a similar thing in my hearing, my sentencing hearing. Well, I pled guilty when I was in the DC jail, and then I had a similar.
So this in DC before a federal magistrate in DC.
Before a federal judge, yes.
Maybe it's a DC thing, because I also
it might be a DC thing. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
But I had a similar statement made. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Tricia. That makes me feel more regular. I guess the reason I bring that up is because the law that I violate is the Foreign Agent Registration Act of 1938. I think I'm the 9th American to be convicted of violating it. I don't want to sort of veer off onto a political tangent at the beginning of this talk, but I think we can all do the math about, what would happen if it were really, rigorously enforced. The Foreign Agent Registration Act was passed by Congress before World War II to keep Nazi infiltrators from sort of working with sympathizers in the United States, of which we know there were unfortunately a number, to get the German Nazi messaging out in the United States and keep us out of the war. 2018 and 1938, very different environments, yet the law continues to exist. And the few times that the current Justice Department has tried to prosecute it at trial, they've been sort of, they haven't done very well. So when I pled guilty, and that was the setup, it sort of added another element to the Kafkaesque aspect of everything. This was am I really a criminal? Did I break a serious law? Is this really even a law? I mean, these are questions that are sort of more academic at this point. But that was my first experience as a felon. That was when I stopped being a non-felon and became a felon. So it's something I remember. The criminal justice system is something I never really thought a whole lot about, other than what one sees on TV. It first really kind of entered into my mind as something that I would think about in quiet moments before I got engaged, or before it impacted me, before I was charged with a crime. I worked for a while for a nonprofit called Freedom House, and Freedom House is a democracy and human rights watchdog organization. And I was in charge of its Eurasia programming, which was sort of Europe, Central Europe, former Soviet Union, and Central Asia. And one of our cases was a lawyer who I had hired many years before, who was being politically persecuted by the Kazakh government. And he'd been thrown in jail on a drunk driving charge, or a vehicular manslaughter, and sentenced to 4 years. And it looked very much like it was a political retribution for his being a dissident and helping dissident forces in the country. So I started actively, as part of my work for Freedom House, advocating for his release and a review of his circumstances. And the Kazakh government, I got under their skin for various reasons. When you read my book, you'll understand. The ambassador in Washington went to the trouble of sending an Englishman to come and see me and talk to me about how serious Kazakhstan is about its prison system and modern prison system and reform. And this guy's name was Jonathan Aitken. And he had been a member of parliament in England who had been convicted of perjury and did, I think, 7 months in prison somewhere, and resigned in disgrace. And he told me that he decided the minute that he went to prison, he was going to become the world's greatest expert on prisons. And that's what he was right then, which is why he could explain to me why Kazakhstan had made such incredible progress in having modern and humane prisons. And it wasn't so much that, his argument made a big impact on me, but just the idea that here's a guy who had been a member of parliament in, one of the world's greatest deliberative, systems, and went to jail and went to prison, and it changed him and it made him think differently about things. And I think that it made a little bookmark in the back of my head that I would think about later. But none of this really became real for me until I was charged with a crime, or told I was going to be charged with a crime, told that I had been a cooperating witness, or I had been a voluntary witness with an investigation, and I'd been told that I'd become a subject, a target of the investigation. And suddenly it became, my life changed. My life changed then, and my life changed when I became a felon. It's been about 4 years. I pled guilty in 2018. I was sentenced in the spring of 2019. I didn't go to prison. I was sentenced to 3 years probation, 500 hours of community service, and $5,000 fine, which sounds light, but it was actually heavier than the FBI lawyer Kevin Kleinsmith, who lied to a FISA court judge in order to obtain search warrants on Carter Page's phone. Interestingly, he had an even lighter sentence, and the American Bar Association has since restored his practice to law in good standing, which is sort of stunning if you think about it. But anyway, So I was basically tied to Washington, D.C. I was a cooperating witness with the Mueller investigation into whether or not Donald Trump was installed by Russians, which we learned at the end he wasn't. So I was basically property of the special counsel for 18 months as I was going through the process, and then I served my community service. On the last day of my probation, the judge let me off 2 years early for good behavior. On the last day of my probation, my ex-wife asked for a separation, which became a divorce, and I left Washington, D.C. the following day and moved to Maine, where I am now. And I've written this book, which is about what led me up to that point. And it's about a life in politics, largely outside the United States, interfering in other people's elections, so to speak, which is why I became a usual suspect when there became a nuclear-powered investigation into whether or not anyone had interfered in our elections. So my story, which is detailed in the book, begins in Kazakhstan in my early 20s. I went to Kazakhstan at the fall of the Soviet Union. It was the Wild East. My girlfriend at the time, her father was a lawyer for the Kazakh government, and their negotiations with the big oil companies, Mobil, Chevron, as well as the Europeans and other oil companies, to get into what was some of the biggest onshore oil deposits outside of Saudi Arabia. So it was an interesting time to be in Kazakhstan. I developed an affinity for the region. I married a Kazakh. I learned to speak Russian. My son is half Kazakh. And for the sort of throughout my career until I had the good fortune of meeting Mr. Mueller, I worked largely in the former Soviet Union. I worked for a democracy technical assistance support group funded by the US government called the International Republican Institute, and I ran their Moscow office from 2001 to 2004, during which time I actively supported Russian political parties running against Vladimir Putin. I mean, I pushed the boundaries that we were supposed to be equal in terms of everyone we dealt with, but obviously, pro-Western parties are of more interest to us than the communists or, pro-Putin parties. I then went to Iraq after the US invasion in 2004 and worked to help organize the first free Iraqi elections in 50 years. And after that, I became a sort of I stopped being a do-gooder and became a mercenary. I worked as a political consultant. I realized that, there was a value to the advice that I was giving. It was very niche. And I focused on political candidates in other countries for about 15 years, working a little bit in the Middle East, primarily in Eurasia, a little bit in Africa, and some in Southeast Asia and Central America. But predominantly the former Soviet Union, which has been my sweet spot, so to speak, also the source of my troubles. I picked up a client from Paul Manafort, which is how I got onto the special counsel's radar. And anyone who's familiar, which is probably most of us, with how these large federal investigations work, they try and get people to roll on other people, which I suppose in a mob or a RICO sort of context is useful, but when there's no underlying crime, it gets awkward. So that was the case. Now, in terms of the book, what I'd like to do, if I could, and I don't know how much time do I have, I've got about 15 minutes. I'd like to read a little bit from the book, but before I do that, I'd like to explain what it's about. This is a memoir, but it's a thriller-like memoir. In other words, I don't go into 5-page descriptions of what the wallpaper in a room looked like, or the thoughts I had when somebody offered me a meddling. It's all action. It begins with action and it ends with action. So I use that on purpose because of the political aspect of my story, where our country is right now. We're very polarized. I would lose half of the audience instantly just given, people's strong beliefs about the way things are. And then when the other half figures out what my beliefs really are, I lose a lot of them. I'm a Republican who didn't support Donald Trump. So it's, kind of stuck in the middle, as I think more people than are commonly thought actually are. My first thought in terms of what I wanted to call this book was Between Two Stabbings. And the reason that I was going to call it that was not just because of the Jackson Flickus, funny show about Between Two Ferns, but because I was stabbed twice in Washington, D.C. That's another part of my connection to our capital city. First in 96, around the time this book begins. And again, at the conclusion of the book in 2020. People talk about how bad their 2020 was. Well, mine ended with 8 puncture wounds, courtesy of a disgruntled individual on 14th and Florida. So that was sort of, I thought the stabbings were sort of nice brackets for everything that happened in between, but they're not entirely connected to the content of the book, which is sort of like, it's about what it's like to be an American abroad, trying to push American values and sort of, profit and enjoy from the American century while it's ending or while it's already over. And that's part of what I witnessed in this arc from 1996 until 2018. That's a whole separate argument, and I don't want to get academic and say when did the American century end, but that's part of the background. Why did I do this? Why did I write a book? I mean, I think there are a lot of reasons why people write books. My bottom line reason is to tell my part of the story. I had Rachel Maddow feature me on her show 6 times, in my absence. So she got to tell my story, but I've never gotten to tell my story. So that's really the driving motivation I had. And when I was attacked in 2020 on the street in Washington, D.C., and I assumed I was dead. I'd been stabbed a bunch of times, and I was still being stabbed. The guy was hacking away at my back. And the thought that I had was, God damn it, I didn't finish that fucking book. And it was that thought that made me angry. And it was that thought that made me question my attacker. And it was that thought that made me fight back. So, I guess that kind of goes, the goal had started out, make grand statements about the way the world is and how I fit into the world and the hero's journey and all these wonderful things. But what it ended up being is just, I want to tell a story. And process-wise, I had extreme difficulty. Although arguably I could have tried harder, but on 2 pitches for major publishers, just largely because of the political landscape, the political and demographic landscape, in terms of getting a publisher to say yes. I had a lot of interest, but then people would say, "Ew, we're too small a Republican," or remember 500 junior editors at Simon & Schuster said they wouldn't take Mike Pence's book. So unfortunately, I don't have the clout that Mr. Pence does. So he was able to push through that. For a lot of other people, it's tougher. And I decided to go the self-publishing route or the hybrid publishing route, which is sort of an adventure in itself, because you take on all the risk, essentially, or most of the risk. My publisher does have some risk, but I paid for the publication, and my publisher has a small stake in it. So who knows, this may be a way that the industry is going in the future. It's my first experience with it, so I'm not sure whether there'll be more of this, or how things are going to develop in the publishing industry. But I do know that if I ever write a book again, I'm going to get them to pay me in advance. So with that said, I don't know if I've described enough about the book. I think I've sort of given an idea of what it's about. I would like to read just a little section of it, and this is fairly far in. This is in chapter 10. But it gives a flavor, and it also sort of talks about how I got into this universe. It starts with a quote. It's me yelling, "God damn it, Pepper, quit barking." I grumble to myself in the dungeon of my basement office as I'm putting the final touches on an op-ed for the Jerusalem Post. I'm on deadline and I can't be disturbed. My wife, Laura, left her job at the FBI a couple months ago and has begun working for a global consulting company, which in practical terms means she works from home now. She'll deal with Pepper, I think, as I reread the piece quickly before hitting send. But Pepper is on a tear. Almost always a mild-mannered husky, something about the dog's insistence troubled me. Whatever she's agitated about is at the front door, and my office has its own entrance just beneath. Expecting a call from Kostya, I clutch my phone and step into the front yard to see what the fuss is about. 3 men in suits are arguing with Laura about something. Seeing me, Pepper stops barking, and one man shows me his FBI badge as another man points to my phone. That, he says, is what we're looking for. I'd already had a bad feeling lurking overhead like a dark cloud for about a week now. Coming home from a trip from Florida, I got 2 calls while waiting at baggage claim at Reagan Airport's Terminal 1. One was from Ken Vogel, an investigative reporter at the New York Times, who told me that Russian oligarch Victor Vekselberg had just had his phone seized by the feds at JFK Airport. The other was from my son, who was at home and had just answered a door to men in suits who did not identify themselves. I think they're with the government, my son said, but when I asked why, he thought that, he reasoned, because of the suits. More pressing on my mind than Russiagate was the fact that Cambridge Analytica had nearly destroyed Facebook days before. Cambridge Analytica is one of my major clients and had sent me to Mexico just two months prior. As the establishment lurched for someone to blame for the election of Donald Trump, the London-based analytics and political consulting firms seemed like an easy target. Not without a warrant, you don't, I say defiantly, still trying to figure out what's going on. The cockiest of the agents presents a warrant with a smug grin and tells me they're taking my phone whether I hand it over or whether they have to resort to other means. With that, I ask them inside to continue the interaction more privately. They beckon over a couple of technical specialists who are waiting in a nearby truck. You know, if you had resisted, we'd have used overwhelming force, the cocky agent says. It's better this way. We just want to talk. Not without his lawyer, Laura, my wife, interjects. She is smarter than I am. Never, ever talk to the FBI without a lawyer. Just ask retired Lieutenant General Michael Flynn. During his brief tenure as Trump's national security advisor, 2 FBI agents central to the Russia investigation interviewed him in his office with the express intent of, quote, making him lie, court documents later showed. With this, the mood darkens. I offer them coffee, but the cocky agent makes a show of declining. We'd prefer not to, he says, mimicking what I told him when they asked me how I came up with my iPhone password. Sometimes with law enforcement, the movie suggests there's one officer or agent who plays the need to push his or her dominance gratuitously, and that was this guy. Perhaps he's an understudy to Peter Strzok, the agent who set up Flynn after famously boasting to his mistress that he'd stopped Trump from becoming president. I'm not the only guy who finds this guy to be a dick. Laura points out to him that until recently, she also worked at the Bureau. Oh yeah, he says dismissively, we knew that. You were a contractor. In government bureaucrat talk, this is a put down. Slowly, I realize the dick is not in charge. There's a quiet little blonde guy named Brock who is actually the senior agent, and others are deferring to him. Do I have to put up with this kind of abuse? I ask Brock. He thinks for a minute and then instructs the dick to wait outside. Meanwhile, the techies are downloading my phone onto some kind of computer they built into a fat metal briefcase. My contact list shows up on their computer's screen as they scroll through it, stopping for a minute at the B's when they see Steve Bannon's digits, and looking at each other and smiling. Is that what this is about, I wonder? I'd had dinner at Bannon's house several nights before. Is that what triggered this visit? Suddenly, I remember Kostya and I had been chatting online just before the raid. This would be the wrong time for him to pop up on the screen, I reason. I borrow Laura's phone and send him a brief note letting him know what's happening. Another agent asks me if I have a pen and I lend him my green Waterman. Just like in The Americans, I say jokingly, referencing the FX series in which Soviet spies infiltrate the FBI via a pen with an embedded microphone. At this, they all look at me in unison. You watch that show? One agent asks, intrigued. Oh, come on, people, my look says, get real. As they finish their download and prepare to leave, Brock pretends he just remembered something and hands me a paper. It's a subpoena signed by Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller, summoning me before a grand jury at an unsaid date. Fuck, I think. They really are that desperate. So that is that's about, that's getting towards the end of the book. A lot of the action happens before that. It's not all legal process, but it sort of that's the beginning of my legal process. And just getting back to the sort of the idea of a book, I want to credit another book in closing. And this is a book that I learned about because it was fashionable at the time that I got in trouble. And I started studying my judge because I knew I was going to go before this person was going to decide whether or not I went to prison. I should know a little bit about them. And they had just sentenced a Dutch lawyer for lying to the FBI. And in the sentencing of this Dutch lawyer, the judge lectured him and she said, "You're not a gentleman of Moscow." She said, referencing the book in sort of one of these, clever DC ways, as if everyone had read it. So that made me intrigued. And I bought the book, A Gentleman of Moscow, and I read it. And what it's about is a Russian aristocrat at the time of the Russian Revolution who gets stuck, or he goes back to Russia to save his sister and is imprisoned by the Bolsheviks. And instead of killing him, they put him in the Metropole Hotel, which is an old hotel in downtown Moscow, and he has to live in the attic. And it's about his humbling, and he ends up working as a waiter in the restaurant of the hotel. And I just like to read. This is something that I think we all have in common, and tell me if I'm right. But it's a passage in the Gentleman of Moscow that moved me. Talking about how two characters connected, the protagonist and another character. Like the Freemasons, the Confederacy of the Humbled is a close-knit brotherhood whose members travel with no outward markings, but who know each other at a glance. For having fallen suddenly from grace, those in the Confederacy share a certain perspective. Knowing beauty, influence, fame, and privilege to be borrowed rather than bestowed, they're not easily impressed. They're not quick to envy or to take offense. They certainly do not scour the papers in search of their own names. They remain committed to living among their peers, but they greet adulation with caution, ambition with sympathy, and condensation with an inward smile. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Sam, thank you. That was I was riveted. We'll obviously the floor is open for questions, and if you'd like to, please put your name in chat, and we'll just take them in order. But Sam, I wanted to ask you, it kind of, I don't know, to me it takes a person who, a special kind of person who can, especially dealing in that part of Europe and Eurasia, if I'm using the right term. I mean, it's a dangerous place. And I mean, there had to have been times when you were concerned for your physical safety. And I guess my question is kind of what kept you there doing it when you knew that you could very well be a target, especially if you were doing things to not support Vladimir Putin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of my early heroes in Russia was a guy named Boris Nemtsov, who I quickly bonded with when I got there. And I followed him around the country for a year in the run up to parliamentary elections in 2003, I think they were. And that was that was the end of Russian democracy right there. That was the period of Putin's consolidation of power. Initially, he played by the rules. He'd been put in place by the family, and things were done fairly slowly and deliberately, and waiting to see if anyone would notice or give a shit, and none of us did. I served in the Bush administration, so I can, I can take, plenty of, even though I was complaining early on before I served, George Bush looked at him in the eyes and saw his soul. And that administration didn't take Putin seriously until he invaded Georgia in 2008. So, you know, a lot of people got Putin wrong, but that's what I'm guilty of, really. That's my crime, Bill, is other than writing, because the physical aspect of my criminal complaint is placing op-eds in American newspapers. But my crime is having dangerous company. And the reason I got in trouble is because I put myself in the company time and time again of dangerous people. In fact, my last wife was a government employee and qualified for USAA, which is the insurer of the military. And so she wanted me to have a life insurance policy for obvious reasons. And so I applied for a policy with USAA, and they researched it for a long time, and they sent me a letter rejecting me. And it was a fascinating letter because the underwriters had obviously spent some time on this. And they said, because of my work, and specifically because of my work in Ukraine and my putting myself in proximity of potential targets of assassination, I was an uninsurable person. And so I kept the letter somewhere. It's in a file. And yeah, I got a little thrill out of that, I guess. There was a little bit of thrill to it, but there's also a sense that if you want to be on the bleeding edge of history, you can't just do it from behind a screen. And I think that's changing now that everybody is, you know, experiencing the world through screens. But it was, yeah, I took the last course at Georgetown where Soviet foreign policy was a politics course, and the next semester it was a history course. So it moved faculties while I was taking it, and you know, history was happening, so it just seemed logical to be there.
Great. Oh, thank you, Sam. I got to remember to unmute myself. Greg, you're next.
Cool. Thank you, Bill. Sam, thank you so much for that. Your narrative is wickedly descriptive, and I was right there with you all along the way. And I think that's a real skill and a gift. So kudos to you on a job well done. 2 questions. One, I'm just curious about what was the experience like of, you know, having Rachel Maddow those several times tell your story and being an observer of that. What was that experience like? And number 2, these are 2 very disparate questions. When I was writing my book, I pulled back a little when I was writing about one of the FBI agents in particular. There were some details, there were some things he did, some things he said that I would have been well within my right to include, but quite frankly, I got a little fearful of doing that. So I kept them, when it came to the cutting room floor, that's where they found themselves. And I'm curious if you held back at all for similar reasons.
Given the FBI's performance in recent years and where they stand in terms of the esteem of most Americans, you know, I think the last thing we want to do is be fearful of them. And that's one side. The FBI's fucked up, you know, enormously, and we all know that. I also think they're fall guys. I grew some degree of empathy for the honest agents who I encountered, because they've been handed this crock of shit and, you know, told to work through it, and, you know, had numerous pressures pushed on them to work through it. And, you know, they came to the conclusion they should have come. John Durham's, you know, concluded after his study, they never should have opened the investigation in the first place based on what they were presented. I think that the FBI was put in a very difficult position, you know, from the whole 2016 emails business through Russiagate. So if my contempt is not for the FBI, it's for the political actors behind the false narrative. That's, and those are the ones who won't be punished, you know, and that's how it always is. It's going to be some, you know, it's some 20-something-year-old lawyer who lied to the FISA court judge. He's the only FBI official who's been charged. You know, what's his name? McCabe is still on CNN. Amazingly, I don't know why they pay him, but we turn on CNN and we see this guy who's perjured himself before the country. But I didn't, you know, I didn't feel, I have a cooperation agreement with the government and a plea agreement. So, you know, I don't talk about what they asked me and what I told them. That's my understanding with Mr. Weissman. I think we all understand Mr. Mueller wasn't 100% there. So, yeah, I don't talk about those things. But in terms of the behavior of government agencies, I think it's we have to hold them accountable. I think trying to do anything different would be sort of undermining to American values.
Appreciate that.
Thanks, Sam. George?
I say
go right
that,
ahead.
you know, I may be
Oh, go ahead.
charged tomorrow, but we'll see.
Hi everyone, George here. Sam, thank you for your story. I got a little bit late, and I guess I got the most important thing. Me personally, I grew up through communism in Czechoslovakia, so it's like playing the tape for me. What you sharing? My uncle immigrated to Switzerland in '68, and our family just got little fucked through through my school years. My old brother, my parents lost passports, you know, jobs and all that stuff. And what kind of first, I admire your courage to be able to talk about it and write book so openly. And what my question is, or kind of would like to know your opinion, what will take for this country to learn from the mistakes what is happening on the different part of the world and where I came from, for example, because today we're sitting here, you're sharing openly, you put some names there. Obviously you have target on your back, and I don't think the target will disappear until something big change. If we do that, maybe next year, this same session, we might be arrested next day. That's what happened in Czechoslovakia. You know, like you said, the man's in the suit, they didn't introduce themselves. They just put people in jail without any reasons, and the family didn't see them for decades sometimes. You know? So I am just getting, I live beautiful life in America. I have beautiful kids I live American dream, but I came here 2002, today is 2023, the country is totally different. And I'm just wondering, what will it really take to get this country to back what was after September 11, when we were so united and have the God, the patriotism was in mind of people, and they were so united.
Well, first of all, yeah, condolences on the loss of Milan Kundera the other day. He was one of the reasons, he was one of my favorite writers when I was young, a great Czech writer who just recently died. What will it take? I don't know. I mean, when I worked at the State Department, my boss, her father had been the head of something called what led to the Victims of Communism Foundation and the Captive Nations Resolution that Dwight Eisenhower had passed in the 1950s to look at the countries that were behind the Iron Curtain as being captive and recognize that they weren't free, and to start focusing on that. And I think, you know, we all get spun up into narratives, and there was the Cold War narrative, and then it ended, and sort of people kind of lost orientation and priorities in terms of what was what. I think in a lot of ways we're a naive country in terms of how we practice our democracy and what propaganda we choose to believe. I've spent about 10 years doing intensive political work in Ukraine. And so hundreds and hundreds of polls that I've read about how Ukrainians consume media. And every Ukrainian, regardless of whether they're Eastern or Western, and they love to say this pro-Moscow. Well, you know, that's a figment of of somebody's narrative imagination. I mean, people are people, right? Everybody watches and reads everything. And the reason they do is because they are smart enough to know after 70 years of communism, you can't trust anything the media says. And you shouldn't think that you could. How naive to think that you could. I read everything from Mother Jones to Breitbart, because if you don't, how are you going to have any idea what's going on? So in our country, we still have people in their tribes that trust their media sources as sources of truth and revile the other side. And I think a lot of other countries are more sophisticated and advanced than we are in that respect. I think, you know, freedom is, you know, just like love is something you can only experience, you know, through loneliness. Freedom is something you can only really appreciate through captivity or some experience of captivity. And, I think that other people's stories help, but until, I remember when media freedoms were receding in Russia in the early, late 90s and early 2000s. And it wasn't, there were about 15 to 20% of people who cared and the rest didn't. And that's just, people prioritize. It's about what's most important to me right now. And people anywhere will sacrifice freedoms for the convenience of the moment. And, that's always a concern. I'm not that pessimistic, despite everything I've been through, about our state. I don't think democracy dies in darkness. And I think that there's been a lot of shrill talk about democracy in America. We're still practicing it. We still have the peaceful transfer of power. There's a lot that we can learn from what we've been through. And hopefully we do, but I think it's going to take a little time.
Sam,
I wish
thank
they
you.
could learn from your experience. I wish we could learn
Yeah.
from the former Soviet Union's experience and not have to repeat it. But to some extent, we're doing that right now.
George, thank you for your question. Sam, thank you. Trisha.
Yeah, hi Sam. Thank you for
Hi.
your share and all that you had. I gave like a little synopsis of my backstory just because I don't know your email address, but I would like to connect with you.
Okay.
My main concern right now is what to do about the ongoing influence of the FBI and the DOJ with regard to post-release thriving, because I've already had a situation where I was working at a pre-IPO startup. I'm a corporate lawyer by trade, and I was working at a pre-IPO startup, and my little synopsis kind of gives you backstory, but I've been a lawyer for 18 years, and I was married to someone very, very high up the DOJ. And as part of our divorce, during our divorce, I made the mistake of talking to him about a transaction that I made with cryptocurrency, which at the time I didn't even realize the person that I was dealing with was on the FBI most wanted list. So he ended up turning that over to the FBI, and then that resulted in my criminal charges. Okay, and it was a crime, and I didn't know it at the time, but technically it was a crime, and that was my one count that I pled to, and I served 30 months, and I'm out now. But the problem is that I'm having is that the FBI, the DOJ are very unhappy with that sentence. And my lawyers at Kaiser Dillon, I have John Jeffries and William Zapt, who are great. They're great. And I had the great fortune of having Judge Amit Mehta as my federal judge. And he's extremely compassionate and wonderful. Like, I have the utmost respect for him. But they're interfering in my life. And I literally don't know what to do, because they've called my employers and they're like, do you realize you have a felon working for you? And I've already disclosed it, but they're creating like drama. And it's and my lawyers tell me that it's not unusual that they do this, that they when they're unhappy with somebody's sentence, they're going to try to sabotage their ability to re-enter and thrive. So if you have any thoughts about that, I literally don't know what to do other than just report it to the judge. And the judge has been very unhappy because we've had several reentry hearings, and the judge has said, like, this is not acceptable. The prosecutor on my case has said, we're not aware of these calls, but we followed up with them and there's no active investigation on this company, or there's no criminal activity. And he's like, why are you, why is the FBI calling, her employers? Why is the FBI still actively engaged? It's the same agent that was on my case.
It's hard to take a long view when it's your life, when it's actively happening in your life.
Yeah, it's real time. Yeah.
But I think the country has seen so much of the FBI recently. And then we have this ridiculous business about cocaine in the White House, and they can't figure out who it belongs to. I mean, there's the pressures on our judicial system are going to be immense. And the FBI is going to face, now the government never really reforms itself, but there's certainly going to be a lot of noise about it.
There's no accountability. There's no internal accountability for oversight on that kind of activity. There absolutely
There
I
absolutely
mean,
should be, and prosecutorial practice in general, and I think that's a bigger problem. The way prosecutors go after the weakest link, the way they go after those who, you know, if I had fought FARA, if I'd fought the constitutionality of FARA and spent $3 million and gone to trial and gone to appeal, and then, you know, could I have killed the law? Maybe, but they knew I couldn't afford that. And so
right,
it's
and
all,
nobody
you know,
can. I mean, nobody can. And
well,
that's the
no,
thing. I mean, I
Tom
spent,
Barak could. They went after Tom Barak on the same charge, and he said, "Fuck you," and hired the best criminal team you could have in the Eastern District.
yeah,
And
I mean, I only spent like 1.2 million on mine, and I had really, really, really good lawyers. And I was facing, I think, a 92-month sentence, and I got 30 months. I had really good lawyers at Kaiser Dillon. John Jeffries, who's a Supreme Court appellate lawyer, and at Kaiser Dillon, and Bill Zaft, solvent Cromwell guy, who they're a boutique firm. They're really, really good. And I had the fortune of having them, right? But if I didn't have them, I would still be in jail. And so I realized that I did definitely have the fortune of having that. But the point is ongoing. Like, is there any like oversight or any place that you can appeal to besides just, you know, reporting this kind of stuff? Because
other than the court of
I
public opinion, I don't know. I mean, you know, it's one of those things where it's like I briefly worked for Condoleezza Rice, who wrote one of her memoirs was called Twice as Good, because growing up Black in Alabama as a girl, she had always, you know, had the imperative of having to be twice as good as everybody else in order to get equal treatment. And as a felon in America, I kind of feel that applies to us.
yeah,
That we
yeah,
have
at
to
least
do
that.
twice as
Yeah.
good. And we have to have
Trish,
other people say, look at what they're doing to her. Right.
Yeah.
Sam, can you provide your contact information in the chat, or I'll put it in?
Sure.
And
Yeah.
No,
Trish,
that would be great. Yeah.
Trish, yeah, maybe
Yeah.
you reach out to Sam and
Definitely. Thank you. Yeah.
that'd be great. Bill, who's up next?
Rich, you're up next.
Hello, Sam. Thank you very much for sharing your story. It's quite intriguing. I just had a generic question. Or was your stabbings related to your story involving the work that
we
you
were
were
just-
doing at the time, or were you a victim of local street crime?
Well, it's an excellent question. While I 100% don't know the answer, I assume it's the latter. But here's the thing: we're just to Trisha's point about the FBI. Now that, you know, we're all trash talking the poor old FBI. I had been a cooperating witness with a federal investigation of the president of the United States. So when I'm attacked and nearly killed, you know, in broad daylight in the nation's capital, and I have a DC police detective sitting next to my bedside, I said, you know, please call the field office and let them know. And, you know, a couple months later, I come down for the grand jury and I see the same guy. And I said, did they ever get back to you? He said, no. And I don't think they ever looked into it. At the time, they were busy looking for Lady Gaga's dog, as I understand. But anyway.
It's always the same guy.
Yeah, I don't think so. As I was being attacked, and as I had this thought about my book, and as I got angry and decided to at least question, I turned around, asked the guy, why? Why are you doing this? I figured I deserved that. You know, I'm going to die. So if he's going to say Sergey sent me or Pavlo sent me or whatever, then I'll get the message and message delivered, right? And he just had a blank look on his face, like he didn't know. He was whacked out on Lord knows what. He was a schizophrenic. He wasn't taking his meds. So I think it's most likely a case of just somebody who probably shouldn't have been wandering around the streets with a knife. But I never got closure on it.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
All right, Sam, thank you. Drew, go right ahead. No, finding the mute button.
Sorry about that. Yeah, mute button
That's okay.
was bouncing all over the screen. Quick question: If you were a Sam, if you were a cooperating witness, how did you come to become a target? How did that transition take place? Wouldn't you be afforded the protections of whatever the deal was?
I talk about this in my book. It's not, you know, unlike Trisha, my bête noire is not the FBI itself. I thought they were sometimes a little bumbling, but, in the most part, trying to do, most of the ones trying, the bad ones I didn't see. The ones I saw seemed all right. It was the Senate Intelligence Committee, which together with, the House Intelligence Committee, you saw what they did to Adam Schiff recently. You can call it partisan, but he deserved it. He deserved to be censured by the House for what he did as co-chair of the House Intel Committee. The Senate did the same thing. But they were sleazier about it, and there was no accountability. So the Senate was selectively leaking things that I had shared with them in confidence. And, we never know. I mean, they can lie to you, but you can't lie to them, right? So FBI agents, cops, they can lie to you. They don't have to tell you the truth. I had a fancy white collar lawyer at one of the, Gibson Dunn, a guy who had been a staffer on one of the, key investigative committees, somebody I knew well who was connected to a senator on the fucking committee. They lied to him, and he didn't seem to give a shit. In fact, I had a guarantee that they wouldn't bring up FARA in my 5-hour interrogation, and they did as the first question. And they kept bringing it up. Ultimately, I answered it. So yeah, there are a lot of questions. My questions go back to the way in which this narrative was foisted on the country and on law enforcement. That's something that, that's a whole nother story, but I've got to move on with my life. And the stabbing was very straightforward and honest. The guy tried to kill me and he failed. When your government sets you up, it's a little bit different. It's harder to get over.
Well, Sam, thank you. Wow.
Amen to that.
Shoosh. Jeff, would you like to maybe add your thoughts on Sam's talk?
Thanks, Bill.
You're welcome.
Sam, first of all, I want to thank you. This is certainly unlike any of these Tuesday speaker events that we've had before. And on purpose, when you and I talked about it, we thought, let's stretch a little bit and see how your experience is similar to or different than the rest of our experiences. And I've been sitting here listening, and I can't speak better than I could a couple hours ago when I had my tooth extracted, by the way. So I'm not doing bad here. Let me tell you how I view it as the same. Okay, because the differences are there are many, but I think that all prosecutions are politically motivated to some degree, and that's not to take away responsibility for any of our behavior. That's not the point I'm making. I mean, I certainly accept 100% of what I did. Yet there are people making decisions as to who gets prosecuted and why, and what those charging decisions are going to be, and then the amount of vigor they're going to show in terms of the prosecutorial process. All decisions that are made up and down the line that are politically motivated to some degree, if you expand the concept of what political means. And certainly based upon what's good for them and not necessarily with a view of how it affects us or any of the wreckage it might cause to innocent victims. So it's so interesting for me to hear this, because so many times people will say to me, the prosecutor doesn't like me, or the judge doesn't like me, or the so-and-so doesn't like me. And generally my response to that, based on my experiences, they don't like you or not like you. They don't care about you. They care about themselves. They care about what's on their agenda. And to a large part, we're roadkill. We've been hit by a semi, and now we're on the side of the road, and people are going to pick at our bones like vultures. And no matter what side of this they're on, whether they're prosecutors, sometimes they're defense attorneys, sometimes whoever, we're we're there, and they're going to take every last scrap of meat they can before they're done with us. That's why it is so important for us to come together as a community and share information and share our stories and our experience, because that is power. We can't be fooled if we're paying attention. That doesn't mean we can't be hurt. That doesn't mean that we don't have to pay the consequences of what we've done, but we can't be fooled, because we as a community actually have more information than even the government does. I mean, God knows Google has more information than anybody does, but we've just, as an entire criminal justice community, as the 70 million people in this country who've been prosecuted, we've just been too lazy to organize it in a way where we have the ability to defend ourselves and fight back. So what I've gotten out of your talk is what happens when you're communicating at the very highest levels with people who are making world-changing decisions, and then you realize that you are a person. You are now in this intricate, a cog in this intricate thing that is no longer working for you, or you are no longer working for it. Instead, it is working against you, and you have to make decisions that are going to have consequences far beyond what most of us have to look at, far beyond. Because just one other thing, when it came right down to it, it was pretty much me and my family. I mean, that's the deal. I mean, there was nothing I had to look at that was beyond that when it really came right down to it. Go defend, don't defend, spend this amount of money, don't spend that money, trust this person, that. But for you, there was a lot of stuff going on that was way outside that margin. So that's what I'd love to hear about. Like, what are all the things that you had to think about, and what made that different than just the way that most of us have to look at it in terms of just trying to get through it and recover?
I think thanks for that question. I think the hardest thing is it's not going away. The former president of the United States, who wants to be president again, won't shut up about it, right? He keeps whining about how it's affected him. Well, last I checked, he hasn't been charged with anything related to Russiagate. But so it keeps getting brought up, right? And that's the harder part, is that, you try and move away from something, but things in the news won't let it go away entirely. And so I guess for me, that's made me think a lot more about fairness, and how do we, this whole concept of life being fair. Well, we all have come to learn that that's not necessarily the case, right? Unfair things happen. How do we accept that and move on and not be crippled by anger or resentment at the unfairness that happened? And for me, it made it easier in a way, because our whole country was going through shit, right? The whole business with Trump and the impeachments and all this, and everybody freaking out at every tweet and not knowing where the world, everything was upside down, right? So it was that hard for everyone. And then after my home confinement, or I wasn't home confined, but I essentially was de facto home confined, there was COVID. And the whole country is home confined. So it's sort of like, I was going through something that the whole country was going through, and that made it in a way a little bit easier. And this conversation made it easier for me too, plugging into the conversation about criminal justice reform. And for all the negative things, you know, depending on your politics, you think about Trump, one positive thing was that his son-in-law was committed enough to the idea of criminal justice reform that he made his stupid father-in-law pass the First Step Act, and you know, sort of a first step towards looking at reviewing sentencing, federal sentencing, and nonviolent crimes, i.e., all these goddamn drug crimes after the '94 crime bill. So that, you know, the sense, the hope that maybe there's some change coming. And that is a national discussion and a national dialogue. And increasingly, you know, it's been a national discussion about, do we have a two-track system of justice in America? And Merrick Garland actually said earlier this year, we do not have a two-track system. Why the hell does the Attorney General of the United States have to say that? I mean, isn't that sort of in itself galling? You know, this is something, what used to be just our problem is now America's problem. Right? So people are having these conversations and thinking about these things. And in a way that makes it easier. Does that answer the question a little?
Yeah, I think so. Back to you, Bill.
Hey, Charlie, you wanna wrap us up with a question for Sam?
Well, yeah, thanks, Bill. Sam, thank you for a really most interesting presentation. I'm looking forward to reading your book. My question is continuing the theme that you just described, and part of moving past the past. I'd like to know, is your book designed to be a cleansing for yourself? Because one of the things that I've struggled with is to not talk about my anger about the system or how it was dealt with, but merely accept it and do what I can to improve the system for others, because I can't solve my past. I can't change it. So I'm wondering, you know, what the underlying purpose for the book was.
Mm-hmm.
And second, given your fairly clear view that there is motivation within the government that is not pure. I'm going to be as kind as I can.
Mm-hmm.
Are you concerned about the continuing scrutiny by raising or ruffling feathers? Because when you say things about others that they don't like, others like to say things about you. And I'm just kind of curious, are you prepared for that? Is that
Yeah.
something you don't care about?
Yeah, on the second question first, it's kind of like, what else can they do to me? You know, can they kill me? Yeah, I mean, could they make up a treason charge and execute me? I had an experience talking in DC jail, and I was working on getting a course on politics in the jail there, which serves as DC's prison as well, de facto. And I was talking to a group of inmates, and at the end of my talk in the question and answer, one guy raised his hand and said, "It's pretty obvious based on everything you've said here that you're a patriot. How can you move past what your country's done to you?" And I looked around the room, and all these guys and gals are wearing orange, and I'm going to leave in a few minutes, and they're not, right? That's the basic fact. So I can't wallow in self-pity, right? I'm not in prison. I'm lucky that I'm not in prison. And so I said it could have been worse. They could have made up a treason charge and killed me. You know, I was just thinking in the extreme, and I got a gasp out of that relatively hardened audience. And I thought maybe I pushed it a little bit too far, but I mean, no, I'm not worried about, my belief is if you tell the truth, at least you're accountable to yourself. And what else? They've already charged me with a ridiculous crime. Anything else that they would bring would look pretty fatuous. Will they bring it? Maybe. I don't think so. I think they've moved on to other things is sort of my sense. And was it cathartic? No. I mean, finishing it, yes. But the process was not cathartic. And the reason it wasn't cathartic was because I was very focused on my audience and keeping my audience. And as opposed to like, being in a shrink's chair where you just, or an AA meeting, but even in AA, you want to keep it in the guardrails of the program, right? You don't want to just randomly talk about stuff, but in a shrink's chair where you can just, go on and on and on. I wasn't letting stuff out. I was trying to tell a story that would engage and keep people focused on the story and the action. So for that reason, the story itself wasn't cathartic, but being able to tell the story is, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let me just say that I relate to you because I was in the DC jail wearing orange, and I get it. It's a pretty brutal place. It really is, during COVID especially. So kudos to you for keeping your head up, writing a book. I got several invitations to write a book, and I ignored all of them because I just can't even go there right now. But kudos to you. So thank you for that. Thank you for the presentation.
Time helps, and maybe I should have waited longer. The more time, the better, really, because you can still hear anger in my voice. That hasn't gone away, but I can't guarantee it will be gone in 5 or 10 years either.
Sam, thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks for having me.
Jeff, you wanna close us out, my friend?
Sure. Sam Patten, thank you so much for telling your story tonight. It's fascinating. Thank you, everybody, for being here. This will be on our website and on YouTube in a few days. And feel free to share it. Lots of events coming up in the fall. I think Bill has already promoted our white collar support group that meets on Monday nights. If you want more information about that and aren't on our mailing list yet, please email us at info@prisonist.org and we will get you all that information. So Sam, thank you. Blessings to everyone. Have a wonderful week, and we'll see you on Monday night.
Thank you.
Sam, thanks again. That was really great.
Pleasure to be here. I'd be happy to talk to anyone offline. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks.